All right, so now we're going into our sixth module, and our sixth module in this class is all about social inequality. This is often sort of framed as a conversation around poverty, but the reality is that when we start really looking at it, it makes sense to sort of study both wealth and poverty. There's a whole branch of sociology that's elite studies that sort of looks at the sociology of people in elite positions. We're not getting into that today, but just so you're aware, that's why I sort of talk about inequality. This is not necessarily just people who are suffering, this is both. And when we talk about that, we have to get sort of two concepts that need to be sort of aligned in order to make sense. So the first of those is this idea of social inequality. And that's the material reality stuff. That is about differences in access. That is about differences in terms of do you own or rent your house? How much of your income are you spending on basic needs? Are you getting like how many calories do you have access to? Are you able to own your own car? All of those sorts of things are the like material consequences. This is all of the stuff that gets measured by like what you actually have and what you can do in the world around you. Um, and as far as it goes, we don't talk a ton about social inequality in and of itself in sociology. We do some discussion around the experience, but for the most part, what we're actually interested in and what we talk about a lot more is social stratification. And social stratification is the social half of that stuff, which is to say, social stratification is all of the questions about, hey, what are the social rules that distribute things and create social inequality? And what I mean by that is that essentially, and this is all in your chapter, but who winds up in disadvantaged positions in any society is not random. Okay? It's not as though, any person born is as likely to wind up homeless as they are to be living in a mansion. That's not how that works. There are some people who are much more likely to wind up homeless and some people who are much more likely to be living in a mansion in their sort of adult life. Largely, if you were born and if you grew up in a mansion, you're much more likely to finish your life in one. That's how this goes. And so when we talk about that, often what we're doing in sociology is talking about that sort of question around social stratification and how resources are allocated. And remember, when we do this in sociology, we're presuming that a lot of those questions of sort of resource allocation are choices. They're things that society has done and could have done differently, but we didn't. And so we're sort of looking at those choices, how they are made, and how they influence people's lives. Okay. Um, there's some conversations in that. Social mobility is kind of a big thing. We're going to get to that. How we classify this. There's a lot of stuff in this that, in a lot of ways, we have to do a bunch of background work to make sure that our conversations around social inequality make sense, right? We need some conversation about how we measure it. We need some conversation about what kind of understanding we have of like how much movement there is, and are you stuck in the class that you were born in, or can you shift? How do we even talk about socioeconomic status? That one's coming up next. So be aware that this topic is actually massive. Okay, we're touching on little bits and pieces in it, but it is also an introduction to a lot of other things that are sort of coming up, right? In this chapter specifically, we're talking about social inequality in terms largely economic. So we're talking largely about sort of the way that money is allocated. But we have very similar conversations around power, around the allocation of resources, around conversations around sort of who is valued and who we listen to when we get into our next units, which are all about gender and race, and that we have very similar conversations around social stratifications and then social inequality rather, and then social stratification is sort of the rules on which power is distributed, right? So those ideas about distribution systems and how we understand those choices and their consequences in society absolutely come back later.